Today, I wanted to offer some thoughts about how I view the space of stakeholder engagement, its evolution, and what really matters when we're trying to navigate and resolve difficult community, company, and government engagements, and say a little bit about what really has stood out as a set of important insights and even a mindset about how we can approach these types of challenges more effectively. I call this framework an ARC mindset for more responsive stakeholder engagement. This term ARC comes from an acronym with 4 ideas that I want to clarify today. The importance of deepening acknowledgement and how we engage stakeholders, the criticality of strengthening agency and how we invite stakeholders to help shape and influence outcomes, in particular projects that affect them, the power and importance of reciprocal engagement and how we design for reciprocity to enhance meaningful exchange, communication, and progress in complex disputes. And lastly, but not least, the importance of ensuring clarity of process in terms of roles, responsibilities, and the pathway for problem solving in complex multi-actor disputes. So this spells this frame or arc, as I just described, from acknowledgement, the first A, agency, the second A, reciprocity, the R, and clarity, the C. And we can think about this arc as a pathway for augmenting dignity in difficult dialogue. There is no perfection in these spaces of engagement. There's only progress. But interestingly, classical mediation and dispute resolution has put meaningful emphasis on what we call interest-based negotiation. And that is important. And yet my argument would be that it is insufficient to the nature of human dynamics in complex disputes, especially where there's power disparity, where there is multiple representation, where there is an engagement between authority, the private sector, and impacted stakeholders. What really matters? So again, these 4 ideas, I'll take each of them just for a minute or two and then wrap with a quick summary. So this first piece about acknowledgement is what I would call a gateway to effective engagement. We've all heard the power of effective listening and so on. And yet my point is that acknowledgement matters in terms of creating the space for potential exchange. Acknowledgement is not the same as agreeing with your counterpart or critic, but rather demonstrating that you are hearing them and using that as a way to augment spaces for constructive exchange. The ability to do this is simply not just listening, but really going as deep as one can to understand where key points and views are coming from and to integrate those into the problem frame. What are we trying to solve for collectively, given different perspectives, as diverse as they might be? Secondly, is this idea of agency. Again, how are we sharing and framing spaces for influence in both process and outcome? It is a very challenging space for authorities and companies as well to intentionally open space for constructive influence on how issues are solved. And yet, stakeholders will not engage meaningfully unless they see that their contributions are shaping what is happening to them and the issues that they care about. How do we shape questions and problems in ways that are framed jointly that show that there is a meaningful space for influence? Again, there is tension here about what those spaces are. And yet, if we lead with them with intentionality in how we frame the disputes that we are working with attention to this aspect of agency, it creates the space for constructive engagement. Reciprocity, the R in ARC, is the design of engagement, negotiated conversation and dialogue where there is meaningful and constructive exchange that is well planned in how we design our agendas and the actual sequence of conversations that we have in ways that help augment meaningful exchange of information, ideas, option generation, and ultimately trying to make decisions that are weighed against what we call shared criteria or ways of knowing what might be fair moving forward. So reciprocity is both a structure and also a behavior that we are trying to augment in stakeholders so that they are able to have more meaningful exchange. This is not the absence of conflict or tension that is inherent, and yet it is an effort to design for reciprocal engagement and to use facilitative techniques to get there. And then lastly, again, is this idea of clarity that many times stakeholders, whether they be communities on the ground, they could be indigenous groups, they could be minority groups that haven't been heard well before, come into dialogue with a sense of understandable anxiety about what will happen if they participate in dialogue and decision-making processes. Will they be heard? Will they be engaged? The clarity of process needs to be maintained and protected by the convener, but also by the facilitator or mediator team as well. That clarity matters, and it matters in three elements, as I've mentioned. One is who is at the table, what are their roles, what are their responsibilities, and ultimately, how is decision-making happening in these processes? So when we think about these elements put together, acknowledgement, agency, reciprocity, and clarity, the composite of these ideas and the ability to distill and cultivate greater competency as facilitators and mediators to design processes that give us greater potency in these elements oftentimes can lead to more effective processes, which at its depth, at its core, helps us to strengthen a sense of shared dignity in problem solving. This is not an elixir. This will not make the challenges of this work go away, but it's a mindset that goes beyond simply interest-based negotiation. What do people care about? Generating options, imagining alternatives, making best judgments about how to implement agreements that are better than one's next best alternative. That is important and baseline structure, and yet it doesn't necessarily respond to what matters most in human decision-making, and that is how we feel heard as human beings, the ability for us to shape conversation and outcome, the sense that we have predictable, constructive exchange, reciprocity again, and maintaining a sense of clarity of the process itself and the pathway that we are committing to and putting our energy to as stakeholders, as conveners, and also as facilitators and mediators. Let me pause here and just say that simply this is an important set of concepts. Perhaps additional information can be provided more on this talk if you're willing to go further into the topic. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to share a few of these thoughts with you about what matters most in augmenting the space for more meaningful and responsive dialogue with stakeholders. Thank you very much. And again, happy anniversary to Accordi.